WENY News presents Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Promise of a Dream.
Good evening and welcome to our WENY special, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., The Promise of the Dream. I'm Aisha McKenzie. On this day, the nation is remembering the life and legacy of the leader of the American Civil Rights Movement. The Baptist minister helped lead the charge to desegregate the South and earn voting rights for African Americans. He used his influence to peacefully call for change and share his dream that someday all men could be brothers. It was in August 1963 when Dr. King gave his most famous speech, I Have a Dream, at the historic March on Washington, which drew 200,000 people. Tonight, we'll show you his historic speech in its entirety, but first, we'll take a look at how Dr. King's legacy lives on today. Margaret Washington is an African-American history professor at Cornell University. She is also a well-renowned author specializing in culture, women, and Southern history. WENY's Logan Wilson sat down with Professor Washington and asked her if Dr. King was alive today, what he would think about the current racial issues in America.
If Dr. King were alive today, I think he would be horrified at the racial climate.
Professor Margaret Washington has been teaching African American history for over 25 years. She believes Dr. King was the leader of the most important movement in our country's history.
By virtue of being the inspirational leader for that, and the political leader as well, I think he has impacted profoundly a whole culture, a whole generation, and the impact has spilled over into the next generation. I think we see that with a lot of the openness in American society today.
Given the recent racial tensions in current events, she says Americans can learn a moral lesson from Dr. King, especially moving forward in addressing race relations.
We're a different society now. Our society is far more complex. But I think that the moral lesson that he was trying to impart, which is, humankind is humankind.
As for what Americans can do now to solve racial tension, Washington says despite your race or ethnicities, social media is a good medium for compromise and conversation.
Social media is an excellent way to bring to the forefront some of the racial tensions, and I think people who abhor these racial tensions, whatever color, it's an excellent medium for them to express themselves.
As American race relations evolve, it allows her to expand the way she teaches, finding ways for her students to make historic connections of their own.
And for example, in my course in this past semester, a freshman writing course, Conceived in Liberty, Black Emancipation and the Coming of the Civil War, it actually fit perfectly into what was happening racially without my ever mentioning contemporary times.
The most important piece of history Washington teaches her students is the moral leadership of Dr. King, and that his words are still relevant today.
In his day, they said man's inhumanity to man, but we can, I think, broaden that to say humankind's inhumanity to humankind is still an issue.
Logan Wilson, WENY News.
The Selma to Montgomery marchers are one, if not the most historical protest during the Civil Rights Movement. Black Americans and their advocates walked from a small town in Georgia to the state capitol, all so they could cast a vote without any discrimination. Martin Luther King Jr. led the march, and I spoke with one man who walked with King and was there to see it all.
We can never be satisfied.
Many of us have only read about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but this man, 91-year-old Dabney Montgomery, knew him, fought the same fight as him, and marched right beside him.
We were very close. King was a young man, very serious.
In 1946, Montgomery was fresh out of the military as a Tuskegee Airman, struggling to find a place in the country he fought for. Montgomery says there was just one thing on his mind.
It was early 1946. I went down to vote in Dallas County. The white woman behind the desk told me that in order to vote, I would need to be endorsed by 3 white men.
And Montgomery found the 3 white men to endorse him, but still, that wasn't enough. There were more qualifications he had to meet that were impossible for a black man in the South at that time.
To look at me, and because I am black, that's the reason I was denied the right to register. And I stood there and looked at this, and I said, one day I am going to do something about this.
And what Montgomery didn't know was the man he shared a godmother with was going to lead that movement.
Look, Mr. Montgomery, I want you to meet my other godson, Dr. He was Reverend Martin Luther King. He was working on his PhD at the time. Had wonderful positive thought on how we could solve the problem that we had to face.
After that first conversation in 1952, Montgomery and King stayed connected. Then in 1965, Dr. King went to Montgomery's hometown of Selma, Alabama. And that town would later go down in history as the starting ground for black voting rights, known as the Selma to Montgomery marches.
What a great thrill it was. I marched on the right side of King and back about 100 or more feet in that crowd. To be in this position was something that was, wow, what a great experience this is.
Montgomery served as King's bodyguard, but remained unarmed.
How are you going to be a bodyguard for Martin Luther King when you got nothing to protect him? Well, we were instructed that if you saw a person aiming a gun at him, we as bodyguard, it was 24 or more of us, run to that person, grab the hand with the gun, and yell to the top of our voices, assassination, assassination, assassination.
Civil rights pioneer and World War II veteran saved more than just memories from the 3 protest marches to Alabama's capital. He still has the heels of his shoes that walked 54 miles to prompt the Voting Act of 1965 that prohibits racial discrimination from voting. Stay with us. We'll have more on Dr. King's life and legacy from Washington, D.C., where one of his most famous speeches left a lasting mark on America. Welcome back to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., The Promise of the Dream. In 1963, Dr. King led a march on Washington. Since then, countless memorials and exhibits have been set up in the nation's capital, honoring him and the civil rights movement. But his reach extended far past Washington, D.C., and so do the exhibits honoring African American history. WENY Washington correspondent Lauren Adams takes us to one museum in Alexandria, Virginia.
On the National Mall, construction continues on the National Museum of African American History and Culture. But just a few miles away is another museum. It sits in a quiet neighborhood, but it holds a loud message.
African Americans were part of the fabric of the city from the very beginnings when Alexandria was established in 1749.
Audrey Davis is the director of the Alexandria Black History Museum. Inside are artifacts and stories about African Americans in Alexandria, from the Civil War to the present day. One of the most unique artifacts is this book, which holds information about African Americans who came to Alexandria during the war, looking for freedom.
It's really our honor to honor them because we actually have a record from our cemetery of the first and last names, the age the person was when they died, what they died of, and where they died. And it's a remarkable exhibition.
Today, this building holds a lot of artifacts about African American history, but the building itself has history of its own. In the 1940s, this was the only library for African Americans in the city of Alexandria.
In all of our museums in Alexandria, we all touch on a bit of the African American story, and that helps people understand how African Americans fit into the fabric not only of Alexandria, but also of the country.
And it's that story, shown through pictures, models, and statues, that Davis hopes will inspire people, especially the young people in the city.
If you don't understand your history, you really don't get a great sense of self-worth if you're an African-American child, and I think we do a great job in imparting that history to them and making them feel proud and engaged about their history.
Because that history, Davis says, can never be forgotten. Reporting in Alexandria, Virginia, Lauren Adams, WENY News.
Thank you for joining us as we honor Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s vision, actions, legacy, and his dream of equality. From all of us at WENY, have a good night.
Thank you for watching Martin Luther King Jr. Promise of a Dream on WENY News.